It's a tradition of the KBHN conference to invite a keynote speaker to address and honor the foundational work of Dr. Fraser Mustard, a giant in the intersection of the biological and social sciences in early childhood development. This hour will focus on the search for equity for children in nations within nations. The presentation will explore how systemic state-based discrimination undermines the success of First Nations children, with a focus on legal and public education and efforts to promote culturally based equity. We are so fortunate to have as the chair of this lecture, Dr. Jennifer Zwicker, the Director of Health Policy at the University of Calgary School of Public Policy, Research Chair in Disability Policy for Children and Youth. She is also KBHN's Deputy Scientific Officer. And I'll turn things over to Jennifer now to announce this year's prestigious recipient of the Fraser Mustard Award. Take it away, Jennifer.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So welcome, everybody. We're really delighted to kick things off today with the Fraser Mustard lecture. So each year, Kids Brain Health Network holds the Fraser Mustard lecture. And Fraser Mustard was a pioneer in medical education and research in Canada, with many contributions in these areas. Dr. Mustard was most renowned for his contribution to understanding the importance of the early years of a child's life to the overall development of a human being. In the Fraser Mustard lecture, we honor and recognize speakers whose work really represents the philosophy of Fraser Mustard himself. The intention is to really recognize our Fraser Mustard lecture for 2020. It's really a true honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Cindy Blackstock. Dr. Blackstock is a member of the Gitxsan First Nation and is an executive director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society and a professor at McGill University School of Social Work. She has over 30 years of experience working in child welfare and Indigenous children's rights and has published more than 75 articles on topics relating to reconciliation, Indigenous theory, and First Nations and child welfare and human rights. Dr. Blackstock worked with First Nation colleagues on a successful human rights challenge to Canada's inequitable provision of child and family services and the failure of government to implement Jordan's Principle. This is a hard-fought litigation that resulted in hundreds of thousands of services being provided to First Nation children, youth, and families. Dr. Blackstock recently served on the Pan American Health Commission and Health Equity and Inequality, and fundamentally believes that culturally based equity is fundamental to meaningful reconciliation. Dr. Blackstock is frequently cited in the company of the Caring Society's Reconciliation Barrister, the Spirit Bear, which is engaging children in meaningful actions to implement the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. Dr. Blackstock clearly embodies the vision of the Fraser Mustard Lecture and is an inspiration to Kids Brain Health Network. Please join me in a very warm welcome to Dr. Cindy Blackstock.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's a real honor to join you from unceded Algonquin territory here in Ottawa. You know, we're really at an important point in history where we're seeing conversations of systemic racism and systemic discrimination emerging around the world, and particularly south of the border this past week. It's vital that we embrace this as an opportunity for positive change, and that we no longer leave First Nations children behind in the vision of Canada as a culturally based equitable place where First Nations children get an equitable chance to grow up healthy and proud of who they are, to get a good education, and not have to spend their childhoods fighting for things like a glass of water that the rest of us take for granted. So let's bring up the slides and begin a conversation about what colonialism is. When we talk about colonialism, often we think about the more visual aspects of it, the taking of lands, the taking of resources, and this is definitely part of it. But there's another aspect of colonialism that I want to focus on in the context of the conversation about the lack of equity for First Nations kids. And that is invisible colonialism. And this definition comes to us from Eduardo Galeano, and I find it particularly informative for my thinking. Galeano says, blatant colonialism mutilates you without pretense. It forbids you to talk. It forbids you to act. It forbids you to exist. Invisible colonialism, however, convinces you that serfdom is your destiny and impotence is your nature. It convinces you that it's not possible to speak, not possible to act, and not possible to exist. The other thing I would add to this definition that Galeano presents us with is that the toxic potion of colonialism doesn't just nest itself within First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities. It also has nested itself, in fact, firmly rooted itself in the whole Canadian identity that allows us to normalize discrimination in ways that we can't even see it. Where people from abroad come to Canada and they can see it clearly, but we no longer see it. And even if we do see it, it doesn't have that kind of shock value that it ought to have. So, for example, we still have the Indian Act. It's the only race-based piece of legislation in the Western industrialized world. It creates reserves. People live on reserves. Think about that for a minute. The government of Canada decides who is and who is not a, quote, status Indian. This piece of legislation dates back to Confederation, was used to remove children from residential schools, and is still with us, despite there being reports on the record from 1996, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, that would have led us away from the Indian Act and towards a more just and respectful future for First Nations 20 years ago, but Canada has not acted on it. And that's going to be a reoccurring theme of what I'm going to talk about, is when it comes to colonialism and when it comes to children's inequity, the government often knows the problem, has a solution, and here's the important piece: they choose not to act on it, not fail to not act on it, they choose not to act on it. So let's take a couple of examples of this invisible colonialism. This is an article from last year. And of course, worldwide, we're dealing with the pandemic. And tragically, we're seeing rates increase as the winter months approach. But for First Nations folks, this is not the first pandemic that we've had to face. In fact, this article deals with the depopulation that resulted from disease, but also from willful murder in the first 100 years of colonialism, where it's estimated that Indigenous peoples' population decreased by 90%. So 90% of the 60.5 million people that were in the Americas died within that first 100 years. And I just want you to just think about that for a minute. The loss of knowledge, the loss of experience, of skill, and then the introduction of grief, profound grief. Imagine yourself as one of those 10% that are left and having to carry on from that moment. The scientists in this particular article are linking that significant depopulation of people for whom they are part of the earth, they live in a sustainable way with the earth, with really folks who are coming and viewing the earth as a source of resource extraction from Europe. And what they find is that actually you can demarcate in science evidence of climate change affected because of what they call the Great Dying that happened during that period of time. And this is something that we rarely talk about in Canada or even in the United States. Here's another piece. We know, for example, in a Navajo reservation in the United States, that there were severe rates of COVID. And there was some good coverage, particularly on CBS, about the lack of water in many Navajo Nation homes. But what there wasn't really talk about is the fact that the federal government, like in Canada, funds services on reserve and has done so since Confederation in our case, since the signing of the Constitution in the US's case, at far lesser level than everybody else. And what I'm showing here is government data that shows that really three groups generally get funded by the federal government for healthcare in the United States. That would be American Indians, persons in the military, and of course, federally incarcerated prisoners. And you can see here that on a per capita basis, a federally incarcerated prisoner in 2016 received about $69.73 in healthcare, whereas a Native American person only received $1,297. So that really shows you the inequity. And please know, I'm not advocating that the incarcerated person should receive less, but I am asking why a Native American has received so much less than everybody else. It's just simply not fair. So it's no accident that we find Native Americans at higher risk for COVID and less able to respond, because the service inequities catch you at both places. They predispose you to poor health outcomes and then leave you with fewer resources to address it. Here's another one in Canada, where we've had residential schools and we have the 60s scoop, and there's this kind of rinsing of the Canadian consciousness every time something like this happens. We kind of proclaim ourselves as having learned from the past. We're not going over that again. We're going to say sorry, and we're going to provide some funds to those who are harmed, and it's never going to happen again. But the problem is, it is happening again. So First Nations children are 12 times more likely to be in foster care today than they were at the height of residential schools. And the reason for that is those inequitable services. So the public services on reserve are all federally funded, and they're all significantly underfunded. And what that creates is that perfect storm for families to be at risk of separation of their children, and also less able to respond, the communities. And so we're seeing the same pattern play out. And no one is really asking the question, what did the government learn from residential schools? It's not enough to just say you're sorry. It really has to change the way it thinks and acts. And I'm going to argue that that has not happened to a sufficient level. So we see here in general with children that Canada's a wealthy nation, and yet it does not disperse its resources in an equitable way to children. This is something that you all know. And one of the best investments in the population, of course, is to children, not to people my age. I actually am not a very good return on the investment, but young children, as Fraser Mustard reminded us, are an excellent return on the investment. So even from an economic point of view, it really makes sense to invest in kids. And of course, from a moral point of view, it's an imperative. And yet we still don't have it. And I see one of your themes for your content for your conference is really talking about the internet and how many of us have had to shift during the pandemic. But please keep in mind that only 35% of First Nations homes have broadband access. So these luxuries of online learning or attending conferences are simply not available because of that systemic underfunding. And just this last week, if you were on social media, you would have seen children from a First Nation in Northern Ontario having to leave their community because there is no water. So why is that? You know, governments invite us to think it's because of complexity, but I don't think it's complex at all. I think that, you know, when governments do a lot of complex things all the time, so they negotiated a trade agreement with that crazy in the White House and never claim complexity as a barrier. They can have a can-do attitude to getting kids clean water. There really is no excuse, but it's part of that invisible colonialism narrative that keeps us wrapped up in this kind of incremental equality where First Nations children get less, and yet their communities are supposed to be thankful to the government for the good first steps that the government is taking. So the whole thing about reconciliation is that we have the answers on the books in the vast majority of cases. The issue is the governments are not doing better when they know better. And in fact, I think academia has been somewhat complacent in this, in that we assume that government is not doing better because it doesn't know better. So we do more research, or we get involved in an inquest, or we get involved in a royal commission that really has the effect of giving the illusion that government is doing something when it's really not changing things on the ground. And that is certainly the truth for child welfare. So this is one of the earliest advocates for reconciliation. That's a man named Peter Henderson Bryce, who was Ontario's chief medical health officer, the very first one. And he was hired by the Department of Indian Affairs as a chief medical health officer in 1904. And what he found is that the people in the city of Ottawa were getting 3 times the amount of healthcare funding, and just in that small city then, as all, quote, Indians across the country. And as a result, that was contributing to skyrocketing death rates of children in residential schools from tuberculosis. And Bryce came back to the government of Canada. He pressed them. He said, look, you got to equalize this healthcare funding and then implement the proper reforms. Things very familiar to those of you on the call. Improve the sanitation of the schools, improve ventilation in the schools, stop putting sick kids in with healthy kids. Do all this, Bryce said, and you could save these kids' lives. Canada said, no, it costs too much money. And it makes its way into the news cycle. And here we have a copy of the Ottawa Citizen, but it could be the Globe or the Victoria Colonist. This was broadly covered back in 1907. And you can see editors were so shocked that they put it on the front page. And one of those reading it was a lawyer named Samuel Hume Blake, also from Ontario, later became a judge. And he says that in that Canada fails to obviate the preventable causes of death, it brings itself into unpleasant nearness with manslaughter. So this kind of awakens another mythology about Canada, where people say, well, these things happened back then because people didn't know any better, or somehow we're more morally advanced now than they were then. But clearly, this example of Bryce shows that people of the period knew it was wrong, people of the period were speaking up, and people of the period knew it was not only immoral, that it was quite possibly criminal, what Canada was doing. This is another example. I'll just touch briefly on it. It's a review of the Indian Act in 1946. And really what people are bringing attention to, again, are the unequal services on reserve. So this is, a presentation by the Canadian Welfare Council and Canadian Association of Social Workers. We're going to skip forward a couple decades, but I could list a whole pile of reports that would echo that same finding. This is 1967. You can see this is a report commissioned by the Department of Indian Affairs itself and done by a guy named George Caldwell. What a lot of people don't know about residential schools is that they were actually child welfare placements. Right from the very beginning in 1895, you could be placed into residential schools for, quote, education, which we know wasn't that, or because you, quote, weren't properly cared for. And by the 1967, Caldwell finds that about 80% of the kids in residential schools are there for that not properly cared for provision. And he echoes what others had before, which is provide more services to kids and their families, and they wouldn't need to go to residential school. They could be safe at home with their families. This is 1967. That's 53 years ago. And keep in mind, the last residential school did not close until 1996. So this brings us up to 2016. I actually got involved in a national scale in the latter part of the 1990s. And I was one of those people, like probably many of you, that thought the reason that Canada is providing unequal funding in child welfare and other children's services is because it doesn't know any better. I did not do that first step that I now recommend others do, which is look at the past reports. Instead, we became involved in doing a study with Canada and coming up with solutions. Canada liked the first report. We got a nice letter from the minister and they didn't do anything. We did another report because they said they needed a more detailed report. So we brought together 20 leading experts, First Nations folks from all over Canada. And we did another report that showed that the shortfall in First Nations child welfare was 70 cents on the dollar. It also showed something else, is that Canada was failing to provide equitable services necessary for children's health because children were First Nations. And that sparked Jordan's Principle, which is named in memory of Jordan River Anderson from Norway House Cree Nation, who spent 2.5 years unnecessarily in hospital, eventually dying there because governments said he was First Nations and they couldn't resolve who would pay for his at-home care. So instead of paying for the at-home care, one level of government, and figuring it out later, they left him in the hospital and he dies there. The family said, let's make sure this doesn't happen again. They created Jordan's Principle, which is about ensuring First Nations children have access to public services when they need them, free of any discrimination. House of Commons voted for it and then didn't implement it. So we launched this, along with the Assembly of First Nations, as human rights complaint in 2007. Canada fought it on technical grounds for years, but finally in 2016, we get the decision. And the tribunal finds a couple of important things. First, it substantiates the complaint and orders Canada to cease its discrimination by properly implementing Jordan's principle and by ensuring equitable funding and child welfare. But it also noted this pattern of the Canadian government that was very consistent throughout the years. Experts raising the flag, saying, look, these kids are being hurt by your unequal funding. The government being able to see evidence of that unequal funding and in the harms for children, unnecessary family separations and deaths of some children. But even at that, they don't remedy it fully. They just simply seek to kind of kick it downstream. And so the tribunal held jurisdiction over the complaint, which is very important because it turned out, although the Trudeau government came out and accepted the decision, they didn't implement it, and we've had to go for now, I think, well over 10 non-compliance orders. So we're edging closer to equality, but we're not there yet. And just to let you know, some people think, well, they didn't really understand Jordan's principle. Maybe that's why they didn't do it. But they did understand it. They actually, when they passed through the House of Commons, they created a definition so narrow, no child ever qualified. And they actually gave Michael Wernick, who was later the Privy Council clerk, but then Deputy Minister of Indian Affairs, thought this was such a good job on behalf of the public servants of saying no to these kids that he gave them the highest award in the federal government to public servants, and that's the Deputy Minister's Recognition Award. So discrimination in 2011 in Indian Affairs was not just normative, it was award-winning. So what kinds of things have I seen with systemic discrimination in the colonial context? Well, one is this idea that this is too complex to give First Nations kids equitable treatment. That's hogwash. We all know that. I mean, other children aren't discriminated in the same way because of their race in the provision of public services. So why is this so hard? The other is the incremental approach, just taking the programs one program at a time and dealing with the inequality one drop at a time, and expecting First Nations to be thankful to the government. Well, that is a system of systemic discrimination. The other is the dehumanization of these children. They would often refer to them as a file or an acronym, really losing sight of the human impacts. And when critiques would come in to the government of Canada, their immediate reflex is to defend it, instead of asking the question, does that critique have merit? There's some other things too about overriding First Nations opinions and really overstating their involvement with First Nations communities. They'd often say, well, we talked to First Nations and they like this, and that wasn't really true. So now with Jordan's principle, thanks to the tribunal's orders and Jordan's family, we were able to ensure that $3.1 billion in services and products in health, education, and child welfare and social services went out to First Nations kids last year. Of those, about 70% are just to achieve formal equality. Jordan's principle also allows for substantive equality in that the tribunal said that because these kids have been shortchanged for so long, there may be services that they need that other children may not be eligible for. And that's accessible through Jordan's principle. And all it requires is the consent of the guardian and a professional to be able to make a note about what the child needs and for how long that need will be in place. And you can call this 24-hour line, both in English and French, 24 hours a day, 365. And soon Jordan's principle will be available to First Nations children without status off reserve as well. Right now, First Nations children with status under the Indian Act off reserve and on reserve are eligible. And soon it will be First Nations kids who are recognized by their communities but do not have status off reserve as well. So this brings me to kind of this whole question of equity, and we know the science well. Is that really, this is the closest thing to a silver bullet in social sciences, is reducing those inequalities can have a whole broad range of effects. And that's why it's so important that we do it. But I want to just emphasize here in the report that was chaired by Sir Michael Marmot, the Just Society's Health Equity and Dignified Lives, the PAHO report, that we retake the determinants of health to recognize the land as a determinant of health. You also see climate change in here, but climate change is a Western idea in that it situates the climate only as important as the threat of human beings. But for Indigenous peoples and for many others, we are of the land, and therefore that's an important part to include. So take a look at that model as you think about how to decolonize in your communities. The other thing we're doing is we're actually working on a holistic funding model that doesn't just ask how First Nations kids can be safe at home. Of course, we want that. But what would it cost for First Nations children to thrive? So we've worked with the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Development, and we have this proposal for addressing the structural drivers of poverty, poor housing, caregiver substance misuse, and mental health that drive First Nations into care at the overrepresented rates. And finally, we have the Spirit Bear Plan. So what it is it was passed by the Chiefs in Assembly in 2017. It says, look, we as a country, we can end these inequalities. No more drop by drop approach. Let's cost out all the inequalities from water to child and maternal health, early childhood programs, education, and then let's create something like a Marshall Plan to remedy them all in one go. And let's end this discrimination against First Nations children in a leap, not in a shuffle. This was adopted by the Chiefs in Assembly in 2017. Canada has not implemented it. The other piece that it asks for is an independent 360 evaluation of the Government of Canada. Why doesn't it do better when it knows better? I think in some ways that's what Canada's probably resisting the most, is it doesn't want to change its way of being. But I think it's fundamental so that we don't set up an apology for another generation of kids. We have a bunch of learning guides for Spirit Bear to really engage children in understanding what systemic discrimination is and how they can learn from the past. And children have been such great allies to First Nations children as we've been going through this, writing letters, coming to the tribunal, learning, and really being active participants in ending this discrimination. I think it's because children don't normalize the racism in the same way that adults do. And they also want to be a part of creating a country where every kid matters. We have a bunch of activities that you can do in your families or you can have your patients do. It's called Hibernating for Health. They're all COVID friendly. They're all free, and they often are just fun or just take a couple minutes to do. So follow Spirit Bear. And one of those things is an animated film that tells the story of the tribunal and Jordan's principle. And that was done courtesy of Spotted Fawn Productions. It is an absolutely beautiful film. They just did an amazing job of this. And you can find out about a screening in your community or in your network of circle just by emailing us at that address. So you've seen that I've used the word First Nations. I've done that deliberately. The word Indigenous is often overused. The Indian Act and the type of discrimination I'm talking about only applies to First Nations children. Jordan's principle has been extended to also apply to Inuit children, which is wonderful. But I really urge you to try to be very specific in your terminology, because there are types of discrimination that apply only to Inuit or to Métis peoples as well. And when we use the word Indigenous, we're failing to get at some of those key drivers to address it. So I think I'd leave it there. I'm just going to make a plea that all of you do something about this inequality, because without every one of you taking some action and getting the Government of Canada to turn course and end these inequalities all at one go, I think 50 years down the line, we could be looking back at these orders and this opportunity and wondering why we didn't do any better. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Cindy. That was very powerful. And we're going to have some time now for discussion. So we'll have a little bit of discussion between us with a few questions I want to start off with. But I wanted to encourage everybody that's online to chime into our. We've got a Q&A on the side. You'll see a box where you can post your questions, and I'm going to be monitoring that. So please go ahead and put your questions in there. But I wanted to start off with that thread of around equality that you were talking about. And you talked about this challenge around incremental equality and where we kind of have a tendency in a lot of our systems to address reforms say, health or education or child welfare very independently. And I loved the comment about equality for kids is something you have to do in a leap and not a shuffle. So how, as certainly as individuals, but as a network of researchers and families and service providers, how do we collectively as a community work towards making that leap?
I think that we have to actively engage in the conversation with those who are choosing not to implement the equality for First Nations kids, and that's the federal government. Some people are nervous about politics. Like I often get some people say, "Ooh, that's too political." I think it's very important that those of us who are involved in children's health are political. I would say because that's where those decisions are made that can affect children's lives. The key is not to be partisan. I don't care what political party ends this inequality. I just want someone to step up and do it. And we ought not leave our own timidity as the reason why we allow children to really suffer under the multiple burdens of inequality. There's no excuse for racial discrimination against kids. And none of us should ever stand for a government that gives a penny less or a dollar less or 50% less to a group of children just because of who they are. Like that is unacceptable, but that's still happening. And everyone in your network has an opportunity to speak out and do something about it by just even as simple as get on Twitter and tag Justin Trudeau, say implement the Spirit Bearer plan. That we have 7 free ways on our website. It doesn't take a lot. And also to educate others in your circle about this inequality and get them engaged in some of these solutions. Let your patients know about Jordan's principle and get them accessing those services so that life is a little easier for them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, it's amazing the resources that you've developed to kind of help people engage and learn through the process. One of the things we wanted to pick up on was, you've been talking about Jordan's principle and commented on, the ongoing need to kind of make people aware of the how to implement Jordan's principle. And you've talked before about moving from being a statistic to kind of the real people and the stories behind people's experiences. And I think that's been a really powerful message that you've been putting out there. Can you, as researchers, sometimes we're not as good at doing that. Can you give us some advice around what you've found has been very helpful in really using stories and people's experiences to have those impacts?
Yeah, I think first of all, it's very important that you respect anybody's story as being sacred. So Jordan's story is a very sacred thing. So we work with the family around how we present Jordan's principle, how we talk about Jordan's principle. So you need to have that relationship. And you need to understand what the story is intended to do. I think sometimes people make the mistake of having a young person talk at a conference about some tragedy they've experienced or some illness they've experienced without a very clear idea about what can be done about it. What are we supposed to do with that information at the end? Because these children, young people, and families, they volunteer their stories and hope that it makes other people's lives better. So I think when we're using those stories, we have to engage and see that covenant through. So when I was working with the Jordan's family, I knew there was no off-ramp, even when it became frustrating litigating with Canada. Almost a decade went past before we saw any progress, but you have to stay with it. And there is, I think one of the pieces where Jordan's story was so important is it was generated by a real life experience of a child. And a lot of people could imagine what it would have been like if that was their child. We talk a lot about parent support in a medical profession. Can you imagine if a parent, and this is actually real life for many First Nations families, is if your child could be better, but because of their race, they're being denied the treatment. It doesn't matter how much you work hard, doesn't matter how much you love that kid, it's not going to make a difference because the government has decided they're not worth the money. So I think that kind of story really caught a lot of people. And what we found in the evidence, though, is that the government quickly got away from that. It was almost like we're going to allow ourselves to discriminate by dehumanizing these kids. And one story that just still shocks me, that shows you how dangerous it can be when we become so distant from humanity, is around the time when they were giving that Deputy Minister's Award, there was a 4-year-old little First Nations girl who goes in for dental surgery. And something goes horribly wrong, and she ends up in palliative care around the Christmas season of that year. The request from the physician is a hospital bed so that she can hospice at home. The request goes through 15 different people in a public service before someone writes on there, absolutely not. You know, and then they're worried about what the public might say if they gave this child a bed. Like, I cannot believe that, right? It's such a lack of faith in the public. I can't imagine anybody out there protesting in front of Parliament because we gave a child who is in hospice a chance to be with her family during the holidays, right? And yet that's what they thought was the right thing to do. And so it's really important that we share these stories, that we humanize these kids. And for everyone on the call, a book I use a lot about how to frame the message when you're using stories is George Lakoff's Don't Think of an Elephant. You can get it on paperback at Amazon or your local bookseller. And it helps those of us who are working on evidence-informed approaches be able to frame our message in a way that other people can understand it.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I guess another thing I was wondering about is, you've also been really showcasing the experience of children, the voices of children.
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit more about what strategies and approaches, when does that work well, and when is that kind of a good approach, and when is it, something where you have to kind of consider putting children in those situations?
Well, really, it was the kids who taught me. I fell into the trap, and I think many of us are in it, of doing work for children. So when we did the human rights complaint, one of the things I was very clear about is we had to make this case visible, that discrimination's best friend is darkness, especially with the government, that we had to somehow invite people to simply watch the case, not take a side, just watch it and make up your own mind about what was happening. So we had this campaign called I Am a Witness that invited people to come to watch the hearings. They could do it virtually. They could also read all the court documents. But the real truth is, no one came, especially those in the children's community. And in 2009, we're in the courtroom and Canada's trying to get it kicked out on these jurisdictional grounds when a group of high school students show up. And this young guy says to me, "We're from alternative school, which means we get into trouble a lot." And I said, "Good, so do I." And here's a key thing, is getting into trouble for the wrong thing is for amateurs, right? That's easy. But getting into trouble for the good things, like John Lewis has talked about, good trouble, that's hard. And we don't always teach kids how to do that. And this young person said, "Look, I get into trouble and sometimes I deserve it. But sometimes it's the systems that deserve it. And no one's taking them on. And you want our help, so we're here." And then they came to the next set of hearings with their friends wearing I Am a Witness t-shirts. And then they brought their younger brothers and sisters. And by 2012, so many kids were showing up at the hearings that we had to have them in an overflow room. And what the children could see was the unfairness. And they had asked their teachers, why does that exist? And one of the key things that we said to the kids is you have to be like a newspaper reporter when you hear about things like this, which means you have to listen to all sides of the story, including the government side of the story. And then you have to get on the internet and do some research and then talk to your teachers and to your family members. And then you make a decision about what feels right for you. And if you think that there is discrimination, then here's how you can help. And then when new pieces of information come in, then you have to judge whether or not you still feel the same way based on what you now know. That's part of teaching them and mentoring them in the critical thinking and making sure that the teachers have the resources to tell the full story. And I always encourage them to listen to what the government said. And in fact, the courtrooms were often most full when the government was doing its presentations. And I think that that's very, very important. The other thing is that we need to trust kids with the truth. Sometimes we soft pedal issues. And I think we do children a disservice, particularly kids on reserve, because what happens for the kid on reserve who's being discriminated against is they don't know they're getting less funding for schools and water than everybody else in most cases. They just know life's a lot harder for them. So what do? They get on the internet and they see other kids doing okay. So they start to internalize it, which we all know is what kids do, right? When there's problems, they internalize them. And they start to think that they're the problem, that they're not smart enough, that they're not good enough. And we do need to, that's why it's so important to not only teach them about this particular type of discrimination, but give them the tools to be live actors in loving, peaceful, and respectful ways to be able to change it. And not only for First Nations kids, but for all kids. And I think it's essential, especially after what we've seen this from Trump in the US. We need to equip this generation of children with the ability to see systemic discrimination and to respond to it.
Thank you. That's a great answer. We have a question from one of our trainees, and so I'm going to bring Fakri into the conversation. Great, go ahead. Hi, Fakri.
Thank you so much for bringing me in. My name is Dr. Fakri Shafai, and I am the Vice Chair of the Kids Brain Health Network Policy and Research Trainee Committee. Dr. Blackstock, thank you so much for such an interesting and thought-provoking talk. As research trainees, we often have to navigate the status quo in order to climb the ivory tower of academia. How would you recommend new trainees find the courage to incorporate and fight for the principles of reconciliation with First Nations people as we move up the ranks in academia?
Well, one of the things I really think is a missed opportunity, it's a great question, is really instructing this, people on the story of Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce, who was really one of the earliest advocates of really meaningful reconciliation. Here was a white guy from Mount Pleasant, Ontario, who saw that this was wrong, who had sworn a Hippocratic oath and meant it, and knew he could save these kids if they just simply listened to what he was saying. He was a public health officer. It's interesting because at the time there was the guy who said no was a guy named Duncan Campbell Scott. He was the top bureaucrat on the residential school, and Laurier was the prime minister. And what's so interesting is that on the short term, although the public was enraged at the lack of action, and so were newspaper editors, Scott was like those 2011 employees in the public service. He actually got rewarded for saying no. And he kept the status quo within the government. He became known as a Confederate poet, and he actually won an honorary doctorate from University of Toronto and Queen's University. And he had a great ceremony when he left the public service for his loyal service. But just before he died, he wrote a letter that's very interesting. And the closest thing to a lament, he said, "I have never done anything courageous in my entire life." Meanwhile, we had Dr. Bryce, who had the moral courage to speak out and to keep talking, even though he was retaliated against by the government of Canada. He had his research funding cut. He was barred from presenting at academic conferences. And he kept talking, even though he was taking a professional and personal hit for it. He had what I call moral courage. And moral courage is the ability to call out something that's wrong and do something about it, even though you may be taking a personal or professional risk. And we don't teach people, even in law or social work, and certainly not in healthcare, how to create moral courage within oneself. We kind of expect people to have it. And in fact, a lot of the bureaucracies are designed so that they quell it, right? That's the thing with moral courage. In Western society, we reward physical courage. So if you and I saw somebody drowning in a pond and rescued them, we'd be on the front page of the newspaper with a medal around our neck. But if you have someone today who has the moral courage, like Dr. Bright, for example, in the United States, speaking up against COVID, up about COVID, they get punished and they sometimes lose their careers. So how do we create courageous professionals and institutions? Number one is to really get on a YouTube channel called Moral Courage, which has people of all walks of life who are morally courage. And one of the things I try to tell folks is the reason why we're moral cowards sometimes, at least I can speak for myself, is I think I'm somehow avoiding some harm to myself, right? I say, I see something happening that's wrong. And then I have this narrative, well, if I say something, maybe it'll bring up more attention to it or whatever. But really, at the end of the day, I'm really concerned about what's going to happen to me. That's the brass tacks of it. So I let it slide. And then for the next month, I torture myself with what I should have done at the time to step in. This is what I should have done, right? Being morally courageous, and we've all done it. Something happens that's egregious, you step in there, and even if you fail, you showed that other person that you love them enough to try. And you don't kick yourself later on. It's far easier to live with moral courage than it is with moral cowardice. And in systems, remember that checklist I was showing, where when critique comes in, the system should appraise the merits of the critique versus just defending against it. Those are things that we need to enshrine our bureaucracy. And I would love to see a Peter Henderson Bryce Award given out to health professionals who were the whistleblowers within those professions and really exalt those people, because I think those are the folks who should be in the Canadian Medical Hall of Fame. I would like to see Bryce there. We nominated him. He didn't get in, but maybe you guys can help.
Thank you, Fakri.
So
we have a couple of questions. Yeah, absolutely. We have a couple questions on the Q&A. There's been several questions just thinking a bit about, obviously a lot of the work Kids Brain Health Network is doing is around neurodevelopmental disability, and wanting to think about how the Spirit Bear plan really addresses First Nations children with neurodevelopmental disability and their families. Certainly, Jordan's principle really gets at that in some respects. But I wonder if you could speak a little bit more specifically to children with neurodevelopmental disabilities in some of your work.
Sure. Well, first of all, I think if you can imagine, if we were to take children in Canada and cut their public services by 30 to 50%, I'm talking about children with neurodevelopmental disabilities for the moment. And we checked in on those families 6 months to a year down the line. And 1 in every 6 of those households didn't have clean water to drink. Those families who are doing a very loving job and caring job, along with medical professionals, are trying to care for those kids and support them in living their full life in a dignified way, would find that task a lot harder. And that's why dealing with equity is so important. The other thing is that because of the principle of substantive equality that the tribunal has ordered Canada to follow, that means that we can tailor more supports and services to children with different needs, including children with neurodevelopmental disabilities. And not just in one area. If we implemented the Spirit Bear plan, that child would be supported from birth right on up to young adulthood. So in education, in early childhood programs, in health, in being able to get proper health care. It would really provide an equitable opportunity for them to live a life that they ought to have, and for their parents to not be under so much stress. It stuns me that we haven't generalized, like, for example, when the power goes out in Toronto and there's no water for 3 days, and you see all the neighbors up in arms, and people are, oh my God, Starbucks can't make my cappuccino for me because there's no water for the machine. And yet then we see these pictures of these First Nations kids without on boil water advisors for 25 years. And we don't see the injustice with that. That's part of the normalization. So I think it's really essential for all children that we treat them equally, and particularly children with special needs.
Another question has come in around thinking about your comments about kind of the 12 times more likely to be involved in foster care and kind of some of those services. There are questions around kind of unpacking what services in particular are particularly concerning.
Okay, so really, again, just to remind everybody, the key reasons why First Nations kids come into care at that kind of rate are poor housing, poverty, substance misuse, parental substance misuse, multi-generational trauma, and domestic violence. All of those things are responsive to services. For example, there was a study in 2013 in the United States with a fairly large sample of 13,000. And what they did is these were all families who were in contact with child welfare. One half of the families got an extra $100 US. This will show the correlation between poverty and child welfare per year, 100 per year. And what happened is for the families who got that additional $100 per year, the substantiation rate for child maltreatment went down 10%. Right? We know this, right? If you set families up for success, then they're going to be far more successful in caring for their kids. And here's the important point, that First Nations kids are overrepresented because of neglect. But the word neglect suggests that that family has the ability to deploy resources to address the problem themselves. What we know for First Nations families is their ability to influence change on those structural discrimination levels is very limited. And yet we codify it as being a personal deficit, a family deficit. So we throw these services at them and we wonder why things aren't getting better, but we're doing nothing about the fact they live in a moldy house with 20 other people and maybe not have any water, right? So we need to address the structural issues as well as holding people accountable for personal change that's within the realm of possibility. And what the tribunal found in the inequalities for First Nations kids is Canada was not providing any services for families until they really brought their kid into care. When the child was brought into care, Canada would pay 100% of the foster care supports. But before then, there was little or no services available for families who were in crisis. And we felt that was wrong, and so did the tribunal. And not only the tribunal, of course, found it to be unlawful.
We just have time for one more question. And we have a question around, I guess, getting at peer support is really key for families with disabilities. The question's around suggestions on how to bridge non-First Nations and First Nation parent-to-parent communities.
Yeah, I think, well, one of the things we have to come back to is that broadband access issue. Remember, I was talking and only 35% of First Nations parents have broadband access. So that's something you can do, again, is push for broadband access. And of course, in Inuit communities, I don't want to not mention that they also have terrible rates of being able to access internet. So it's very important that we provide that as a fundamental human right. The second thing is really to build relationships in a way that are really authentic. And that means educating those non-Indigenous parents about some of the unique challenges that First Nations families experience. I find a lot of the non-Indigenous families get it really easily. They say, oh my God, I didn't know that First Nations get so much less. Why is that happening? What can I do to help, right? Because if you introduce them and you don't provide that level of clarity, then it's really easy to have misunderstandings, that people are choosing to do things in a particular way on reserve, instead of that's the best that they can do under these very difficult circumstances. And we believe strongly in building respectful relationships across difference. So we have a program called Touchstones of Hope that people can look at. We have a lot of videos and educational materials that build that understanding and allow for respectful relationship. And what I'm so excited about on a very hopeful note is when we look at the children who are active with the Caring Society and achieving equity for culture in a culturally based way, these are kids of every single diversity. Right? When I see them up there, we have this thing called Have a Heart Day where they're in front of Parliament with their letters and they read them out to the officials that are inside. Every possible diversity of children. And they're standing up together for the common value that every kid matters. And they're doing it in ways that don't make one child better than another child. It's about we have to stand up for one another because we care and love one another. And that's the type of society that we need to mentor parents and being able to do that same thing. So it's not just that peer on peer support, it's really engaging them and co-creating a society where every child matters and can feel like they belong.
Yeah, no, I think we have so much to learn as a network from your approaches and actually implementation of kind of the, especially the rights-based context that, you know, certainly we're operating in around UN Convention of Rights of Persons with Disabilities and Rights of Children, and thinking about how you move that from kind of an idea and a theory to actually having policies and services that are aligned with those objective, and then having youth and families and communities involved and really the voices of that work. So, you know, I think that's what we're so inspired by with the Spirit Bear plan. And there's been comments about the website. Certainly, we can make sure that people have understanding of where to find information about that. I just wanted to ask if there's any kind of final comments you wanted to make before I hand it off to our board chair for a special presentation. Are there any last remarks you wanted to make?
I would just say that I think one area of research that goes unattended is the implementation of evidence. Like we do, even like the CIHR and SHRC, they give you lots of money to find solutions, but none to implement it. And I think that there are so many areas where we have got the solutions well documented in good science, and yet we fail to implement it. And that needs to be our next kind of journey in the research community. And to not call our colleagues who are involved in implementation of evidence-informed activists, right? We almost do that like they're no longer academics. To me, what they're doing is they're really honoring those people who have come forward and shared their experiences and stories for us so we can find that better solution. Then we need to really bring that full circle and join with community in implementing that solution. So it makes real change on the ground. So everybody, you can make a difference. Again, doesn't cost any money, doesn't take any time, and you can be a part of the movement of ending for inequality for First Nations kids. Just go on to FNCaringSociety.com, look for Spirit Bear, and he'll tell you all about it.
Well, and implementation is a huge focus of Kids Brain Health Network, so it's a great message to finish with. I'm going to bring in our board chair, David Kuick, to give a special presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Blackstock. Thank you, Jen, for bringing me back in. You know, I have these prepared remarks that I had made because I was doing some research and listening to some of your past interviews in the past, and I've lost some of them because your talk was so powerful, and I learned so much in the process. I want to thank you for coming and giving that talk. I really think, you know, the education of all of us, you know, on our shared responsibility towards inequality of First Nations children is so vital, because I think, you know, I know as a parent the moral outrage I feel for Jordan's family and for other families. And I can imagine if I put myself in it. I opened my comments earlier talking about, you know, my daughter Paige, who has special needs, and I can empathize a little bit. I think a tiny glimpse of what it might be like to have a systemic discrimination against her or us. So thank you for your remarks. I did in researching your background and looking at some of the things you've done, I noted your comments about not addressing inequalities one by one, but developing a holistic plan. And I think I now understand that that is the Spirit Bear plan. And I think KBHN has a role to play that we can and must play. As Dr. Zwicker said, implementation in cycle 3 is vital for us. You know, it's an important part of our mandate and our mission for the next 4 years. And I think as part of our mission to focus on these inequalities for our First Nations children is also important. I think we're doing some work in this area. I think of Dr. Chayo Kulkarni and the Nurturing the Seed project, which was developed in collaboration with elders and Indigenous advisors. Maybe I should say First Nations advisors, to use the proper term. I think that's an example of how we as a research community can be working towards addressing the needs of our First Nations children who have neurodevelopmental disabilities, who are facing inequalities. But I know that's just one program, and we have a long way to go, and I thank you for drawing our attention to it, especially highlighting everybody's moral obligation, moral responsibility to be part of the solution. It's easy to wave your hand and say someone else's problem. That's called diffuse responsibility, and it's not a good thing. So thank you very much for bringing your remarks. Thanks for all the work that you're doing for us as a nation and for our children. With all that being said, it is my honor on behalf of Kids Brain Health Network to award you this year's, the 2020 Fraser Mustard Award for all of the work that you do in our community. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. It is I knew Fraser, actually. I had the pleasure of meeting him. And I know his ethic, his love, and his compassion for all children. And I will strive to live up to his example. And I just want to thank you all for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Blackstock and David, for those remarks. That was really fantastic. And through the magic of virtual conferences, we had the award provided to Cindy ahead of time. So, so once again, thank you so much for your time and comments on this panel. I know it's a great start to the conference. We're very excited about all that we have to discuss, and it sets us up for really a great start. So I'm going to take the time now to hand it back to our MC, Dr. Brian Goldman, to usher us into the next session. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.
And thank you, Dr. Jennifer Zwicker, for that fine introduction of Dr. Cindy Blackstock and her passion and her dedication on such a critical national issue. Thank you, Dr. Blackstock, for your insight and honesty about an issue that we can all work harder to try to shed light on and improve as we move forward. And just to show you how close it is to my heart, on this weekend's White Coat Black Art, we explored the very inequities behind the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on Manitoba's First Nations communities. And I have to say that we glibly list some of those inequities without saying we have to do something about it. In just a half an hour, participants are going to be able to take part in our first virtual networking session in Gathertown. And you can find the link to create your avatar just below this live stream.